The last thing Holocaust survivors expected from the land of Israel was another prison camp. But after years behind barbed wire, they found themselves imprisoned once more for the crime of coming home. This time, it wasn't Nazis holding them hostage, it was the British Empire. Soldiers who had liberated death camps now jailed the survivors in the one place they thought they would be safe, until a rebel militia arrived to send the Empire a message. So how did thousands of Holocaust survivors escape the Nazis, only to end up behind barbed wire once more? The refugees who crowded into the Atlit Detention Camp had almost nothing in common. They spoke different languages, came from different cultures, maintained different levels of Jewish observance. If it hadn't been for World War II, most of them never would have crossed paths. But the Nazi war machine had rearranged Europe. 2/3 of the continent's Jews were gone, leaving dazed survivors to rebuild their shattered lives. The only place they could imagine making their fresh start was the land of Israel, the ancestral homeland where their fellow Jews awaited their arrival with open arms. But in 1945, the Jewish community in the land of Israel, aka British Palestine, aka the Yishuv, wasn't making the rules. Since the end of World War I, the British Empire had been in charge of the Holy Land, what they called the British Mandate of Palestine, trying fruitlessly to appease both Jews and Arabs. But the more Jewish immigrants flocked to the land, the angrier the Arab population grew, wary of becoming a minority in their own home. With another world war looming, the Brits couldn't afford to tick off the Arab world, so they severely restricted Jewish immigration to the land of Israel. They didn't make exceptions for desperate Jews fleeing the Nazis, and when the war ended, they refused to make exceptions for survivors. But the Jews of the Yishuv had no intention of letting their brothers and sisters rot in yet another camp. Well before World War II, they had established smuggling networks, illegally sneaking as many Jews into British Palestine as they could, saving thousands of lives by defying the British Empire. These so-called illegal immigrants became known as Hama'apilim, a complex biblical term repurposed for the moment at hand. Their journey out of post-war Europe was called breakout, escape. Many Holocaust survivors couldn't simply be repatriated to the countries where they had once lived. If their homes still stood, they were now occupied by neighbors eager to finish the job the Nazis had started. In the first months of liberation, roughly 1,500 survivors were murdered by their former neighbors in Poland alone, and similar scenes played out all over Europe. Against all odds, these Jews had survived extermination camps, forced labor, death marches, and starvation, only to be murdered on the thresholds of their old homes. So for tens of thousands of survivors, British Mandate Palestine was the only option. And if that meant crowding into rickety, unseaworthy ships and sneaking in illegally, well, they had survived worse. One more indignity, one more hardship, and they'd finally be free. Some of the survivors did make it to freedom right away, sneaking along the shores of the Mediterranean under the cover of night. But the British intercepted 90% of the ships, dragging emaciated survivors kicking and screaming onto ships bound for detention camps where they might wait years to walk free. At first, the Brits sent Jewish refugees to a detention camp in Mauritius, where more than 100 perished from tropical diseases and inadequate infrastructure. But shipping desperate Jews to die in East Africa was a bad look for the British Empire, especially since they had already built a detention camp closer to home. At its height, the Atlit Detention Camp sprawled across 22 acres, bristling with watchtowers and fenced in by barbed wire. From the outside, it looked eerily similar to the Nazi camps that so many of the refugees had survived. But if their first sight of the camp was traumatizing, their official welcome was worse. As soon as prisoners arrived in the camp, many of them malnourished and unwashed from being packed together on old ships without enough bathrooms or running water, they were sprayed with insecticide, separated by sex, and forced to strip. In the camps, this was a prelude to death. Prisoners wailed and clawed at the British soldiers who forcibly herded them into the showers. And if they caught a glimpse of the large coal furnace that heated their bathwater, many screamed or collapsed or simply went catatonic. They didn't see a heater, they saw a crematorium. After their showers, Atlit's newest inmates were shown to their bunks, overflowing same-sex barracks built for 40, but usually crowded with far more people. Privacy was a theoretical concept. Cots were packed together so tightly that inmates couldn't even reach them to put their shoes or books underneath. Desperate for space, they stored their few possessions in the rafters overhead. At night, after roll call, screams and sobs would pierce the darkness, the memories indistinguishable from the nightmares. The walls of the barracks became message boards as inmates carved their names into the wood just in case a loved one passed through the camp, just in case they weren't the only ones left from their towns, their families, their lives. In the fall of 1945, a new language rang through the camp. The British had caught 40 new Hama'apilim, running not from the smoking ruin of Europe, but from the Arab world. Jews had lived in Iraq for 2,700 years, but when Nazi propaganda arrived, one of the oldest diaspora communities in the world began to crumble. Soon, it would be gone completely. Hundreds of Iraqi Jews were trickling out, sneaking into Palestine on foot via Syria. The journey was difficult and dangerous, but the prospect of staying in Iraq was worse. So when the Brits decided to deport these 40 Iraqis back to Iraq, the biggest Jewish paramilitary in the Yishuv stepped in. The Haganah refused to allow these 40 Jewish refugees to be sent back to a place where they would almost certainly face torture, imprisonment, or worse. For years, the fighters of the Yishuv had put themselves at great risk to rescue their fellow Jews. They braved combat and organized smuggling operations and evaded the British as best they could. They had never organized a prison break before, but they saw no reason for that little detail to stop them. Everyone involved understood the stakes. If the Brits got wind of the plot, they would certainly interrogate and deport everyone involved. But the Haganah refused to sit by while 40 of their brothers and sisters were being condemned to a certain death. They couldn't save the 6 million, but they could give these 40 Iraqi Jews a fighting chance. And while they were at it, they would free anyone who was willing to take the risk, no questions asked. The plan was both simple and incredibly risky. First, the Haganah's elite strike force would send in 7 fighters pretending to be Hebrew teachers. Instead of teaching verb conjugations, the men would case the camp, gathering as much information as possible. Guard schedules, security protocols, number of fences, every detail was crucial. Time wasn't on their side, and their information wouldn't be perfect. But there were no perfect missions, only desperate ones. Late on the night of October 9th, 1945, Haganah fighters quietly cut holes in the barbed wire fences surrounding the camp. Behind them, a larger force waited to storm the complex and guide as many prisoners as possible into the rocky Carmel Mountains. Among the fighters was a man who would one day become Israel's 6th prime minister. But that night in 1945, 23-year-old Yitzhak Rabin wasn't thinking about the future. He was focused on the dangerous logistics of breaking hundreds of prisoners out of a detention camp. The fighters hoisted babies on their backs and toddlers in their arms. They helped the elderly duck through the barbed wire and avoid the rocks and thorns in their path. But the break through the fence was just the beginning. The refugees had to make their way through the Carmel mountain range in the pitch dark, a punishing climb up steep cliffs, pebbles shifting under their shoes. Many of the 208 escapees were in bad physical condition after years of starvation and abuse, and the fighters had to bite back their impatience and nerves as frail survivors stumbled among the rocks. One account recalls that 30 of the inmates got separated from the group, somehow making their way to the city of Haifa on foot, a 12-mile trek through a punishing landscape. The rest made their way up slowly, lungs burning as they pushed themselves to just take one more step towards the safety that lay on the other side. But so did British soldiers. It was time to activate part 2 of the plan. As soon as the former inmates reached the top of the mountain, they were greeted by thousands of Jews from nearby communities. The strike force that had broken into the prison knew that the Brits would look there first, so they rallied every Jew in walking distance to flock to the area. The Brits wouldn't be able to differentiate who had come legally and who had broken out of Atlit. The plan worked perfectly. Confused and irritated, aware that no one would betray the Hama'apilim, the British simply gave up. It was one thing to detain or deport illegal immigrants, but they had no idea who was in the area legally and who had sneaked in, and they lacked the manpower, resources, or interest in verifying each person's immigration status. It was a massive victory for the Haganah, but the work was just beginning. It would take another 3 years for the British to leave. 3 years for the Jewish people to be in charge of their own destiny at last. In that time, the British would detain and deport tens of thousands more Hama'apilim, packing them off to Cyprus, where they had no chance of breaking out of prison again. No chance of mingling with locals who welcomed them with open arms. The British had set their immigration policies based on cold, hard geopolitics, but in their push to be strategic, they overlooked a crucial fact about the Jewish people. When things are good, we're often fractious and divided, squabbling amongst ourselves. But in times of danger, in times of need, we come together, all differences forgotten. It was Jewish solidarity that brought Hama'apilim into the land of Israel, and it was Jewish solidarity that broke them out of the detention camp and into freedom.